This night go shining bright, colors dance in the night. You don't owe them a thing, it's not up for debate.
That right?
It's unprofessional and misleading for Riley NOWLIN to tell juries she knows what time DNA is directly or indirectly transferred to an item. She's relying on old information, and she's in opposition of the scientific community. She's relying on a minority of other analysts from the scientific community who are also relying on old information. She would be misleading a jury if she told them she knows what time DNA directly or indirectly transferred to an object. Even more so, if she used the word touch DNA. As a director and lab analyst, it's her responsibility to stay current in her field. If she tells juries she knows what time DNA transfers to an object, she would be leading the jury to false conclusions. If she tells juries she knows what time DNA transfers to an object, she would be increasing the unnecessary risk of wrongful conviction. It's outside her scope as lab analyst, forensic expert, or expert witness to tell juries she knows what time DNA transfers to an object. Doing so is outside her expertise. The scientific community is aware of the issue for when lab analysts opine on what time DNA transfers to an item and the consequences of increasing wrongful convictions. This is exactly why lab analysts, forensic experts, and expert witnesses are supposed to stay current in their field. Best practices and changing the direction of DNA interpretation is ever evolving, and it requires lab analysts, forensic experts, and expert witnesses to stay current. Especially for Riley NOWLIN, she is a director of the Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho. She runs a system of DNA interpretation. If she's using old methods or training staff with old information, that could skew all DNA results from her lab. It's critical. Riley NOWLIN must stay current within her field, and she must not provide expert testimony that she knows what time DNA transferred to an object. According to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Forensic Science Service Providers, or FSSP, the FSSP, or DNA analyst, should also capture the investigative questions in the propositions they consider. Propositions are sometimes called hypotheses or scenarios. A framework called the hierarchy of propositions can help analysts formulate propositions that are appropriate for the issues at hand. See Table 3.1, which we just looked at. In general, there are 3 levels of this hierarchy: source, activity, and offense. Source-level issues can be broken down further into subsource and sub-subsource issues. The analyst can help address, but should not directly answer questions about whether a given individual is the source of the biological material or not. As explained in Chapter 7. How and when. Questions in DNA analysis. What can or should be said about how and when DNA was deposited is a topic of ongoing scientific and legal discussion. Offense-level issues are exclusively in the purview of the fact finder and are not discussed in this report. Here's Table 3.1. Examples of pairs of mutually exclusive propositions at the source and activity levels of the hierarchy of propositions. NIST further explains, so, how should an expert answer questions about how or when the DNA was deposited in a scientifically responsible manner when they are only able to perform sub-source evaluations? If the DNA expert does not provide guidance, the fact finder may well carry the DNA comparison results over to issues regarding activities. However, this danger does not mean that an expert is justified in providing an opinion, explanation, or speculation on the possibility of any alleged event. Rather, it means that the expert should clearly communicate that the DNA comparison, likelihood ratio, LR, or random match probability, RMP, is not meaningful when considering the question of how or when the DNA was deposited. Evaluations considering factors such as transfer, persistence, and background require an evaluation of the biological results given propositions that address not the source of the DNA, out the activities that may have taken place. This in turn requires the use of data, knowledge, and expertise on DNA transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery, DNA TPPR, see callout box 7.1, rather than knowledge of DNA profile characteristics, probabilistic genotyping software, PGS, and population frequencies. In this regard, DNA TPPR and assessments given activity level. Here's Table 7.1, proposed responses to questions about how or when the DNA was deposited. NIST goes on to say, forensic science service providers, FSSPs, should provide their DNA analysts with training and guidance in accordance with other professional guidelines, e.g., the International Society for Forensic Genetics, detailing how DNA analysts should respond when confronted with general or case-specific how or when questions during testimony. For example, guidelines could include that DNA analysts should not opine about how likely, possible, or probable a particular transfer scenario is, e.g., indirect or direct transfer. This is an opinion on the proposition itself, which is not the role of the expert. Reporting that the DNA is consistent with a particular activity is unbalanced. The DNA results could also be consistent with the alternative activity. What should be conveyed to the fact finder is the value of the results. DNA analysts should not perform qualitative or quantitative evaluations of their DNA results considering DNA TPPR for the first time on the witness stand. Here's what Recommendation 7.1 says. Recommendation 7.1. DNA analysts should not opine about the possibility or probability of direct or indirect transfer having occurred in a case. See footnote 455 for dissent statement. Here's Recommendation 7.2 says, Recommendation 7.2. The evaluation of DNA results given how and when questions is distinct from the evaluation of DNA results given who questions. In order to develop policies and practices on how DNA analysts should respond appropriately to questions about how and when DNA was deposited in a particular case, forensic science service providers should consult professional guidance documents and experts who understand issues related to transfer and persistence. These policies and practices should require DNA analysts to be appropriately trained to respond to such questions. See footnote 456 for dissent statement. Here's what the footnote on page 177 says. Two members, Lynn Garcia and Don Boswell, do not support Recommendation 7.1. While they acknowledge that analysts are often asked to respond to how and when questions in criminal cases and agree that testimony on this subject can be misleading or otherwise problematic, they believe that the broad prohibition in Recommendation 7.1 puts the proverbial cart before the horse by not first requiring an assessment of the type outlined in Recommendation 7.3. Moreover, they worry that supporting 7.1 would imply the need for analysts to shift to a new paradigm that has not yet been sufficiently vetted within the specific context of the U.S. court system. Two members, Lynn Garcia and Don Boswell, do not support Recommendation 7.2, not because training on this subject is not important or necessary, but because they question how FSSPs will determine who the experts are for TPPR and formal activity evaluation training, as well as what constitutes appropriate professional guidance in the United States. They are also concerned that currently available guidance might not employ the necessary safeguards that typically exist in a quality system of an accredited FSSP, e.g., validation, competency, and proficiency testing, appropriate discovery, reporting processes, and similar measures. Additionally, as stated in their objection to 7.1, these members believe Recommendation 7.2 is premature until Recommendation 7.3 is implemented. Recommendation 7.3 says, the federal government should fund collaborative efforts to review the foundations and principles of evaluating biological results when considering alleged activities. Based on the findings, additional fiscal support should be available to educate and guide DNA and legal communities on the review, research, selection, and validation of appropriate methods to account for DNA transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery when assessing biological results. NOWLIN falsely quoted the two members of the NIST report when she said they disagree that testimony about how and when of transfer DNA can be misleading. The footnote states, the members from the NIST report stated opining on how and when can be misleading. It's premature until Recommendation 7.3 can be implemented. Here's Recommendation 7.3 again. The federal government should fund collaborative efforts to review the foundations and principles of evaluating biological results when considering alleged activities. Based on the findings, additional fiscal support should be available to educate and guide DNA and legal communities on the review, research, selection, and validation of appropriate methods to account for DNA transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery when assessing biological results. This to me says, the two members agree, but want more education and guidance. Further NIST shows callout box 7.2, which states, provides examples of very limited circumstances in which a DNA expert may be able to provide a case-specific opinion on the DNA results given alleged activities. These examples come with a caveat that different analysts and different FSSPs may vary in what they consider obvious amounts of material or data to inform such opinions. Future research in this area should contribute knowledge to sources of variability in opinions related to how and when the DNA was deposited, and the types of evaluations that pose the most risk of being inappropriate or dangerous. Here's the article, The Framing of Brian Kohberger. Be very afraid. Here is why. Annie Cherokee Rose, written May 17, 2025. Everyone should be very concerned about what has occurred in the Brian Kohberger case. I think that the FBI sees the potential for setting legal precedent by which anyone can be easily framed and convicted on the basis of unreliable trace transfer pseudoscience. To obtain somebody's blood, saliva, or semen and transfer it to a crime scene is a difficult and high-risk proposition, but obtaining and transferring trace touch DNA can be accomplished by anyone with a moistened Q-tip swab swabbed on an item that has been recently or frequently touched, such as a car door handle or a desk pen. The number of PCR amplification cycles required to obtain enough trace DNA consisting of dead plasmid cell membranes, without nuclei called corneocytes, that are shed from the surface of skin makes it a very unreliable and subjective science when comparing it to another sample. Because there are usually no cell nuclei, it actually requires a substantially larger sample than for other of trace DNA. The higher the number of PCR cycles, the more allele drop-in or dropouts, stochastic stutter, that occurs, which show up as little blips or blobs on an electropherogram, where a very defined spike should be present in order to indicate it is positive for any given loci position. As the inventor of PCR for viral tests said, with enough PCR cycles you can claim a match between any two samples. And viruses consist of tiny amounts of DNA. Means of transference is also very much like transference of a virus or bacteria, person to person, surface to surface, and even through the air. See Dan Crane's show and explain bias in forensic DNA profiling on TEDx Talks. Link below. You can think of PCR amplification and low copy number DNA as being the equivalent of a small, low pixel number photograph. The more you try to enlarge the photograph, the more blurry and unreadable it becomes. What can be seen becomes a biased guessing game. They actually use computer programs to fill in missing gaps with best guesses according to population demographics. In all of the cases in which IgG, investigative genetic genealogy, has been used to find a suspect, I don't think there has been any case in which the DNA was trace touch DNA. It has always been DNA from body fluids. Legislation needs to be passed in which trace transfer DNA from the surface of skin cannot be used as evidence for conviction. But like the vast majority of the public, neither Congress members or judges comprehend the differences between this type of DNA and DNA from body fluids, or the many mechanisms by which it can be transferred from place to place. Eventually, this pseudoscience will go by the wayside, just as claiming bite mark pattern matches or hair strand matches became, but it will take many years, and how many people will lose their lives due to being wrongfully convicted in the meantime. Anybody that doesn't understand the unreliability of trace transfer DNA should look up the Phantom of Heilbronn case, in which the touch DNA from one woman was found at more than 40 crime scenes in Europe over a period of 16 years. It was finally discovered that it belonged to a woman that worked in the packaging depot of a facility that manufactured the sterile swabs used to collect DNA evidence. Did she touch all of those swabs? No. She was only in the same room where they were being packaged. Here's a quote from an article on old forensic science called Bite Marks. The scientific community has moved away from using bite mark forensics in courts because of new information and more accurate forensics. It says, those outside the control of the bite mark practitioners have come to clearly recognize the facts of weak foundational science, absence of empirical proofs, dependence on group acceptance as a substitute for validity, and resulting damaging effects to the criminal justice system. The light of new science shining on bite mark identification flaws. Bite mark identification conflicts with DNA evidence. Analysis of the published literature, court documents, and reports lead to the conclusion that bite mark aspects of forensic odontology and its accompanying bite mark evidence analyses are irretrievably flawed. They are invalid, unreliable, and should not be considered acceptable in the light of new science and professional changes in forensic odontology concerning bite mark evidence in the last few years. Changes within the bite mark profession largely occurred due to new information. Here's a quote from an article titled, "The Tooth Fairy Science of Bite Mark Comparisons." It says, "The practice of comparing bite marks found on a victim to the teeth of a suspect has come under fire for being based on wishful thinking." Here's a quote from article titled, "Maryland's Top Court Calls Bullshit on Ballistic Forensics from the Junking More Junk Science Depth." It says, "So much of what is considered bulletproof evidence in criminal cases is nothing more than pseudoscience dressed in a lab coat. For years, prosecutors have presented sciencey-sounding evidence-legal issues derived from lab techniques that had never undergone any sort of peer review or blind testing. The government, especially the DOJ, has also allowed its hand-selected experts to vastly overstate the veracity of their findings. But almost everything considered infallible has proven extremely fallible when subjected to rigorous examination by zealous defense attorneys, and more importantly, courts willing to actually question the things said to them by law enforcement. It's the questioning that matters. When courts do it, precedent is created and guidelines for evidence submission are established. That's why this decision, PDF, handed down by the Maryland Supreme Court, matters. It not only questions the assumptions about ballistics evidence, it demands better evidence in the future, if cops want to use so-called bullet matching. Here's part of an article titled, "The Field of Firearms Forensics is Flawed." It says, "The matching of bullets to guns is subjective, and courts are starting to question it because of testimony from scientific experts. When a firearm is used in a crime, bullets and fragments can be left at the scene. For investigators, this can be a source of potentially identifying evidence. But can police conclusively match a bullet to a particular firearm? Today, the tide is turning about how such evidence can be used in court. What is forensic ballistics? When a bullet is fired from a firearm, the gun leaves microscopic marks on the bullet and cartridge case. If recovered from a crime scene, examiners can compare those bullets to bullets which are test-fired from a suspect's gun. The marks left on the bullets can be analyzed to determine if it is likely the bullets at the crime scene were fired by a suspect's firearm. In some cases, cartridge cases can also be compared this way. According to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the examiner can offer an expert opinion as to whether the bullet and gun match. However, NIST says the examiner cannot express the strength of the evidence in a numerical way. Recent Maryland decision on ballistics. Maryland's highest court recently decided a case regarding the admission of the opinion of an expert witness on ballistics identification. In sum, the court held that the examiner should not have been permitted to offer an unqualified opinion that crime scene bullets and a bullet fragment were fired from the defendant's gun. While the examiner could have testified that the defendant's gun may have fired those bullets, the examiner could not testify that the bullets could have only been fired by the defendant's gun. The examiner could have said the bullets either were consistent with or inconsistent with being fired by that particular firearm. When reviewing the science behind ballistics identification, the court stated that the reports, studies, and testimony call into question the methodology used. Specifically, the methodology cannot reliably support an unqualified conclusion that bullets were fired from a particular firearm. Just like bite marks and ballistics forensics, the scientific community has re-evaluated the limitation of lab analysts, forensic experts, and expert witnesses from telling a jury that they know what time DNA transferred to an item. This is exactly why lab analysts, forensic experts, and expert witnesses must stay current in their field. Science and forensics is ever-changing. Staying current is part of the job. Relying on old information is unacceptable. Lab analysts, forensic experts, or expert witnesses telling a jury they know what time DNA transferred to an item is now unacceptable. After reading this, what direction do you think the scientific community is going? Should Rylene be allowed to mislead a jury and go against the scientific community? To tell the jury she knows what time DNA transfers to an item? Considering law enforcement initially thought the car was a Nissan Sentra, then a 2011-2013 Elantra. And the photos produced by the state show tinted windows on the car they claim is fleeing the scene. In addition to the misleading information about the cell phone data, recall in the state's objection to defendant's motion to change venue, the footnote on page 10, the probable cause affidavit did not explicitly state that defendant was near the actual home of the victims, but stated that defendant was in the vicinity of a cell tower, servicing the area of the victim's residence 12 times in the months before the homicides. Anyone is near any cell tower at any given time. A cell phone in the vicinity of a cell tower doesn't mean Brian or anyone else was at the crime scene. And so, these two pieces of evidence do not place Brian at the crime scene. Therefore, it's more likely the DNA was not transferred to an object during the time of the crime. What are the chances DNA transferred during the limited period of under 25 minutes? Considering law enforcement has identified different cars and made misleading statements about someone being near a cell phone tower because their phone might be in proximity, even when it's possible someone could be in a different area, and a cell phone could bounce off of several towers. It seems unlikely DNA transferred during the time of crime. Considering the previous mentioned misleading evidence of the type of car, in the photos the state has produced and the actual variables involved in a person in proximity of a cell phone tower, how does someone state in court they know the exact time? How does someone know what time DNA was transferred to an object, a sheath, that's a movable object that's not the weapon used? Are they psychic? They know what time a movable object arrived at a location, and when DNA transferred onto that movable object that isn't the weapon use? How does anyone know the sheath didn't belong to someone else, like a victim or a neighbor? Sheaths are common in an area with cougars and wildlife that can be threatening to students or joggers. After reading this, what direction do you think the scientific community is going? Should Rylene be allowed to mislead a jury and go against the scientific community? To tell the jury she knows what time DNA transfers to an item?